Ukraine has zero path to victory that doesn't include a massive commitment of U.S. ground forces. Donald Trump has been the sole voice of reason, and you're a fool. I mean, you're a fool not to be on his side on this. Donald Trump is seeking peace when the whole world is conspiring against him, except the people who elected him. EU, they want war. The Uniparty wants war. The Washington war machine wants war. The World Economic Forum, they want war. The Zelensky wants war. This would be World War III. If the United States ends up in a hot war with Ukraine, a war with Russia, a hot war with Russia would be absolutely a bloodbath. This is critical that you understand this. Now, welcome to another episode of Ideas Have Consequences with me, Larry Alex Taunton. And again, I am coming to you from Rome, and I am really interested in beginning today by talking about President Trump's, not an official State of the Union address, but we just as well call it that. And just a couple of things about this before we start talking about Ukraine, the war in Ukraine, because I want to make sure that people really understand what's going on there as we see EU leaders trying to take us towards what would effectively be World War III. But let's first start with Trump's address and my take on it. First of all, I thought it was terrific. I didn't watch it live because, it wasn't broadcast until it was, I don't know, maybe 2 a.m, where I am. But the first thing that I did was I got up and I found it on YouTube and I watched the entire 2 hours of it. And I thought it was terrific. And my takeaway is that it was a pep talk, really a pep talk to the American people. It wasn't an address to the Washington establishment. He just ignored them, nor even was it meant for foreign powers, be they friend or foe. Trump was speaking to the people who elected him. And he was letting us know, I'm your guy. I'm your guy. You elected me to drain the swamp, and that's what I'm here to do. And you elected me to fulfill an America First agenda, and I'm doing it. And so I'm not going to rehash the entire State of the Union address, but I just want to focus on 3 particular moments in this. Now, the first 2 of them are funny. The first that I have in the hopper here is where he talks about the weaponizing of government institutions.
And we have ended weaponized government where, as an example, a sitting president is allowed to viciously prosecute his political opponent, like me. How did that work out? Not too good. Not too good.
I personally thought that was the best line of the entire night. Now, I know a lot of people thought another one, the second clip we're going to show you, was the line of the address. But frankly, I thought the mic drop moment came when he said, now, how did that work out? How did that work out? Now, here he is, the guy that they did everything they could, not just to put him in jail. They weren't satisfied with that. They wanted to destroy his personal wealth. They wanted to destroy his family. They wanted to destroy his reputation. They wanted to grind the man and everything that he loved into powder. And the guy managed to endure that. I don't know that I know anybody who could have endured the kind of withering attacks Donald Trump endured. Say what you want about the man. So you don't like his tweets, or you think he's, pompous, or whatever it is. I don't care. I mean, Donald Trump, honestly, really is the man for the moments. In spite of whatever faults you perceive him to have, I perceive him to have, the fact of the matter is he has managed to do really what seems kind of impossible, and that is that Donald Trump has seen the resurrection of his political career and of his personal life. It isn't just his political career. I mean, again, they wanted to obliterate everything about the man. And we were talking about raids on Melania's, underwear drawer. I mean, this is the kind of stuff the left was doing. And they were sure that they were going to get away with it and there wouldn't be any accountability. So for him to now be standing before the Nancy Pelosi's, who no longer, she's not Speaker of the House now, ripping up his speech. She's sitting down there, looks like she's gumming herself with her, her dentures, or something. And here's Trump saying, how'd that work out? How'd that work out for you guys? You came after me, and the result is that I'm now standing here. And I'm standing here and I'm pursuing not revenge, I'm pursuing justice. And I think that's exactly what he's doing. Now, the second moment in the speech is the one that most people consider to be the mic drop moment, and that's this.
The media and our friends in the Democrat Party kept saying we needed new legislation. We must have legislation to secure the border. But it turned out that all we really needed was a new president.
Well, that statement is so true, isn't it? I mean, we just needed a new president, not just for the border, but for the economy, for the war in Ukraine, for the Justice Department, for Homeland Security, for sensibility across the board in the United States, for morality. We needed a new president. And Donald Trump has been that guy. I mean, what a line. His speechwriter really hit a home run with this. And then we come to a more serious moment. And that's this right here.
I was saved by God to make America great again. I believe that. Thank you.
Now, that's an interesting comment coming from President Trump. It's not the first time that he said it. There are some Christians who get on their high horse and seem a little bothered by him saying this. Maybe it's because they perceive it as a, kind of pompous remark that here he is saying, I'm so important that God needed to spare me. That's not the way I'm hearing it. I think President Trump sees himself as now having a mission, a mandate. Now, he spoke of a mandate coming from the American people because he won the popular vote and won every swing state. He said that in this particular address. But I think he's talking about a divine, mandate. And I got to tell you, being a guy who has something of his own divine mandate, I totally get it. Those of you who, I've talked about it before, my own very traumatic accident where my back was broken, my neck was broken, all my ribs on my right side were broken. I was not expected to live. Lost 50% of my blood volume. My own doctor said that was a miracle. And I got to tell you, when you survive something like that, and Donald Trump turning his head, that was a miracle. I mean, it really was. When you survive something like that, you have this feeling that I think is a real feeling. That is to say, it's a genuine sentiment more than just a feeling. That God has spared your life for a reason. So if in my case, where there were those at the scene who said I was dead and then revived, there's this feeling, that for whatever reason, the Lord decided not to take you. He decided he wasn't taking you. And if I as a Christian, I believe that when my time is up, when he's ready to take me, that's the moment I'll go and not a second before. And it fills you with a sense of purpose. It really does, a sense of divine purpose that he's kept me alive for some reason and for a time. At some point, he will take me from this earth. Now, that could be before I finish this podcast, or, it could be I might live, another 50 years. I might be the George Burns of podcasters. I mean, who knows? But you have this sense of divine mission that the Lord has spared you for a reason. And at Butler, Pennsylvania, the assassination attempt on Trump, people were killed, and him just turning his head. That's what saved his life. Now, I know that there are some who would be very skeptical, who would suggest that, this was just a coincidence. No, I think it's divine. I'm reminded of Esther chapter 4, verse 14, which says this: "For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. There's this idea that's being expressed here, and if you don't really understand the context of this particular passage, a magistrate, a very wicked magistrate, a Joe Biden-like magistrate by the name of Haman, has carefully arranged a plot to destroy the Jewish people. And so Mordecai, hearing of this plot, goes to Queen Esther, who herself is Jewish. And he says to her that she needs to go to her husband, the king, Xerxes. She needs to go to him and tell him of this plot and ask him to spare the Jewish people. And she's, initially a little reticent. She's thinking, well, nobody can go in and, talk to the king. And he says, well, if you don't, the Lord's going to save us, but maybe not you. Meaning that he will use someone else to achieve the purpose that he has. And biblically speaking, that is so true. It simply means this, that when the Lord has purposed to do something, he's going to do it. Now, he can use you or he can use somebody else, but he's going to do it. And so the little asterisk I would put next to what Donald Trump had to say here, that the Lord had spared his life to make America great again, and we'll talk about that part of what he said in just a moment, is that I would add this. I would want to say to Donald Trump, that may very well be true, that the Lord has spared you. He definitely spared your life for some reason, and maybe to save the life of the unborn, maybe to bring peace in Eastern Europe or in the Middle East, or for some purpose that we don't even know yet. But I will tell you this, Mr. President, that if you chose not to do it, if you had purposed it in your heart to reject whatever plan the Lord has put before you, he'll raise up somebody else and do it. The will of the Lord, the desire of the Lord, the plans of the Lord will not be thwarted. And it's very important for us to realize that, because it really gives us the opportunity to join him, as it were, in his own plans. He gives me the option to do that. And I hope that I do that, at least in part, in a show like this, and some of the other things that I do that are a little bit, below the radar. But my mission is in serving him, and I find mission in defending the faith, in demolishing arguments, as 2 Corinthians 10:5 says, that set themselves up against the knowledge of God. And also I find it in giving voice to the voiceless, defending the weak. That's an important part of my mission, and it's a biblical mission. It's a divine mission. It's one that the Lord has kept me alive for however long he chooses to do it. I could have lost my life recently in Cairo, but it didn't. And that's because the Lord has purposed that was not my time. He's not ready for me to go. And I think this is what Donald Trump is getting at here. So I think that's a very important remark that he makes there. Now, in closing my remarks on the president's address, I just want to remind you of something I've been saying for the last month, and that is this: we are winning. We're winning. Be encouraged. It's going to be, I'm not saying that the battle is over. It is by no means over. It is going to be a long, dirty fight, but we are winning, people. Take heart. Be encouraged. Now, take a look at this, for example. Look at these people. These are the Democrats sitting there. They never clapped. They never stood. They, one of them had to be removed from the Capitol. I mean, how embarrassing is that, to have to be removed? I'm sure he thinks that makes him a hero. No, that just makes you an ass. And I thought, I couldn't help, when I was watching this, seeing how the Democrats were behaving, I couldn't help but think, whoever it is who is advising them hates them and loves Donald Trump, because they're going to get wiped out in midterms. I mean, they didn't cheer tax breaks. They didn't cheer, a boy being made an honorary member of the Secret Service. They didn't cheer a young man getting into West Point. They didn't They didn't cheer that the people responsible for certain crimes, Lake and Riley and so forth, had been arrested and were being prosecuted. They didn't cheer any of that. They came off as jealous, as petty, as hateful, and as miserable human beings who are fundamentally anti-American. I mean, that's the way they came off. And a part of me thinks I'm glad they came off that way, because that is who they are. They came off that way because it is who they are. And whoever is advising them, we need to double his pay, because he's doing a great job in helping them sink themselves. I expect them to get wiped out in the midterms, but we'll see how all of that plays out. But again, we're winning. And when I look at that image of the Democrats sitting there, what I think to myself is, it's often been alleged that Donald Trump was, usually rhinos are the ones who would say these kinds of things, and, leftist media, but they would say that Donald Trump was destroying the Republican Party. Now, if that's true, I'm okay with that. And that's because in its pre-Trump iteration, it was just, the uniparty. So if he came along and actually destroyed it, he definitely has remade it in a big way. And I think that transformation is just going to keep, those dominoes are just going to keep falling. But it was often alleged he was destroying the Republican Party. When I saw the image of Democrats sitting there, I thought to myself, he has definitely destroyed the Democrat Party. He has wrecked the Democrat Party. I mean, look at them. They're just miserable people there. Robert E. Lee's soldiers looked more cheerful at Appomattox than those people look sitting there. I mean, that is the look of defeat. That is the look of despondency. That is the look of miserable human beings who know they have lost and who know that they are going to get wiped out. So that's my take on the president's address. I enjoyed listening to it. I thought that what he had to say was spot on. But again, my takeaway is that he was speaking to the American people. That's who he was talking to. He's speaking and specifically to those people who elected him. That's who he was primarily talking to. Now, let's talk about the war in Ukraine. I think it's important that we take a few minutes to assess where this thing is, how we got here, and why it matters. Because EU leaders, I said on a recent edition of WTF, the show that I do with Lawrence Fox, that EU leaders, they seem, just giddy with at the thought of war, of a world war. They want it. I mean, it's like Meg Ryan in When Harry Met Sally. Yes, yes, yes. I mean, when they think of war, that's just the way they respond to it. I mean, they just are so giddy at the thought of carnage, of the deaths of what would be untold millions of people who would die. Now, let's think about how we got here. Now, in order to do that, I want to back up and cover a little bit of history for you in order to make a point that I think is very germane to the argument. And it's this. We'll start our story in 1959. It was in that year that Fidel Castro, with Russian support, that he overthrew American-backed Cuban regime of Batista, President Batista. And Castro's government was a communist government, and that put a communist regime 90 miles off of our coast. Now, the United States was quite alarmed, and the President of the United States in 1961, JFK, his government tried to overthrow Castro in what became known as the Bay of Pigs. You can look all of this stuff up. Don't use Wikipedia, by the way. Wikipedia is terrible. Don't give them clicks. That's all controlled by a bunch of leftists, a bunch of atheists. Anyway, the United States was so alarmed by the thought of a communist Cuba, a communist country just 90 miles off of our coast, that the President of the United States, his administration, tried to topple that government, and they failed in 1961 in the Bay of Pigs fiasco. Then in 1962, JFK, rightly, I think, he blockaded Cuba and brought the world very close to nuclear Armageddon. I mean, everybody thought that that nuclear war was quite imminent. And that was when the Soviets, when the Russians were trying to put missiles on the Caribbean islands, that of course would be directed at us. They weren't going to be pointed in the other direction, say towards, Trinidad and Tobago. They were going to be pointed at the United States, at key places like New York and Los Angeles and Chicago and DC, of course. That's where they were going to be pointed. And JFK said, no, not having it. I'm not going to allow you to do it. Blockaded the island, and it forced Khrushchev's ships to turn around and take those missiles home. And it ultimately led to Khrushchev's ouster because it was deemed to be such an embarrassment for the Soviet Union, having backed down in that showdown with JFK. Now, America's policy towards Cuba was interpreted according to what George Kennan called the domino theory. Now, some of you will be old enough to know what the domino theory is. Some of you won't be, but the theory held that communism, if it was unchecked, would bleed into one country after another, causing them to fall like dominoes until communism was on our very doorstep. And what you often saw, when I was a kid in the 70s and 80s, watching, current events or in a history class, perhaps when you would see the documentaries, they often showed a map and then red, bleeding out across, the continent of Europe or Africa or South America. And that was communism. That was the domino theory. Again, the idea that one communist country after another would fall to communism until we were essentially surrounded by communist countries. Now, suddenly, the United States, again, according to the dictates of, they were interpreting all of this, the Kennedy administration, the whole West really, was interpreting all of this through the lens, the Cuban Missile Crisis, Fidel Castro's seizure, his so-called revolution, which was really just a coup d'etat, to take power in Cuba. It was interpreted through the lens of the domino theory. So it was deemed very, very alarming. And the U.S. viewed Cuba as an existential threat that was just 90 miles off of our coast, and a threat that was nurtured by the Soviet Union. It was also seen as a step towards further communist expansion in the Western Hemisphere. And of course it was, because there were attempts at other Marxist coups in Central America and in South America with mixed results. Now, fast forward to the present. Since the collapse of the USSR in 1991, NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, guided by both Democrat and Republican administrations from Clinton to Biden, Trump is the sole exception to this. But from Clinton all the way to Biden, both Democrat and Republican administrations took a very aggressive posture towards Russia, and they expanded NATO eastward, just creeping eastward. Since 1999, listen to this. I mean, NATO already existed, and there were numerous Western European, member states. But just since 1999, NATO has expanded to include the Czech Republic, Hungary, Poland, Bulgaria, Estonia, which is a border state to Russia, Latvia, which is a border state to Russia, Lithuania, Romania, Slovakia, Slovenia, Albania, Croatia, Montenegro, North Macedonia, Finland, also a border state, and Sweden. And that's to say nothing of, of other states that we could say bordered, that were already members of NATO. Turkey, we wouldn't say actually borders it, except just across the Black Sea. So in that sense, they're border states. And Norway, I know you have to look at a map, but most people don't realize that Norway actually extends across the top of Sweden and Finland to actually border with Russia. So this this expansion eastward, the Russians viewed this as an existential threat. I mean, again, we took the world to the brink of thermonuclear war because of a communist coup in Cuba and their effort to put missiles on that Caribbean island. We were so alarmed by the idea of that. And yet here, successive, I would say foolish, Republican and Democrat administrations decided, you know what? It would be a great idea to just piss off Russia. Let's just do that. Let's just move NATO increasingly eastward and not put NATO 90 miles off of their coast, but let's put NATO, I mean, right on Russia's border. Now, this would be tantamount to, the old Soviet equivalent of NATO, was the Warsaw Pact. This would be the equivalent of the Warsaw Pact, say, not just Cuba, but the whole of South America, Central America, Mexico, and Canada. I mean, we would be alarmed by that. We would view it as a massive threat, and we would very likely consider taking military action. I mean, we came very close to taking military action in Cuba before. So a point that I would want to make here is that from Putin's point of view, the eastward expansion of NATO was extremely provocative. And this was a point that he made, by the way, in the interview, the controversial interview that Tucker Carlson gave him when he met with him in Moscow at the Kremlin. A lot of people were wondering, why is Putin, rattling on, talking about, history? Well, because to the Russians, the history matters. And to Americans, the history should matter too. He was recounting it because he's recounting two histories. The first history was that of the complex history between Ukraine and Russia, which we'll get to in just a moment. The second history that he was recounting was the eastward expansion of NATO. And one of the things that he says in that interview was he was expressing a kind of, now, what's the deal here? I mean, the Cold War we thought was over, so why does NATO even exist anymore? The Warsaw Pact doesn't exist anymore, so why does NATO exist? And who's the target of NATO? Who are you trying to defend yourself against? And Putin relates a conversation he had, and to be honest, I can't remember who he said the conversation was with, if it was with George W. Bush, or if it was with Clinton, or if it was, with Biden or a Secretary of State, doesn't matter. But he spoke to an American official in which he said, we're kind of alarmed by this creeping eastward expansion of NATO right up to our very borders. We've been warning you not to do this, that there should be border states. But who's the target of NATO? And he said the answer he got was a disingenuous one, and I believe him on this point, was that, well, it's not you. It's, what if Iran gets out of hand? We might need to have an alliance. If they get, nuclear capability, they could launch missiles at Europe. And he said, and he relates this sarcastically in the interview. He says, so I said, well, can we join? Can Russia join NATO then? And he said, I got a very disconcerted look and was eventually told, no, you cannot join. And the point that he was making in the interview is he said, we're quite obviously the target of this. And he points out rightly that NATO isn't a peaceful organization. NATO is a military alliance. That's what it is. And why this history matters for us as it relates to this particular war is because what's happening in Ukraine now is because throughout the eastward expansion of NATO, Putin kept warning that this was provocative. And he kept warning that A, they shouldn't do it, and B, that Ukraine would be the straw for them, that they would not tolerate Ukraine becoming a part of NATO. Now, this is critical that you understand this. Now, in order to truly understand it, you have to understand a little bit of Russia's extremely complicated relationship with Ukraine. There's no Western equivalent to this. I mean, The Middle East, maybe, what we're seeing there and the complicated, relationships that we see there and the disputes over, over territory, over land, maybe. Pakistan and India, possibly Bangladesh. There really isn't an equivalent. Middle East is as close as we get. And that is because, just a clue, and I won't recount here, I have another podcast talked about the history of Russia and Ukraine, but to just show you how complicated it really is, the very first Russian state was founded at what is now modern day Kyiv, Ukraine. It was founded there. It's now Ukraine, but it wasn't called that at the time. That was called Rus, which is where we get the name Russia. And it's part of the reason why the Russians have never reconciled themselves with the idea that Ukraine is independent from them. And that is because they see it as absolutely vital to their survival. And by the way, you don't have to agree with this. That isn't the point. The point that I'm making here is that this is what the Russians believe. This is what they believe. Whether you believe it or not, it is what they believe. It is absolutely what Putin believes. And what I'm recounting to you is true. Now, there's a counter argument to this, but I'm simply telling you the way they understand the conflict. They have always understood Ukraine to be absolutely vital to their existence. It's been their breadbasket. It's been their access to warm water port. It's been absolutely critical to their survival, also geographically, just from the standpoint of defense as a buffer. I mean, the word Ukraine means borderland, which tells you, a little bit of something there. It's a borderland to what? It's a borderland to the Ottoman Empire. Well, was at one time, kind of, but it really means a borderland to Russia. And this is the way they have understood it, interpreted. There's a lot of ethnic Russians in Ukraine. And the point is that it's a very complicated, intertwined history. And this conflict goes back forever. It goes back forever. This isn't new. In other words, do not equate Russia's incursion into Ukraine the same as you would, say, the Russians invading half of Poland in 1939. Not the same at all. Very different. Don't equate it with the invasion of, say, Hungary or Romania. Not the same. In this case, the histories are very and deeply intertwined. And so, NATO was expanding eastward. Putin kept saying, and you'll recall that the narrative when the war began was that Putin was nuts, he was unhinged, it was maybe crazy, he was megalomaniac, he's all those things. Putin is ruthless. He is a dictator. He is in no way democratic, but he is shrewd, and his behavior has been quite logical. In fact, just a Russian history 101 lesson should have told the Obama administration, the people who engineered a lot of this and the trouble that we're seeing now, had they known just that much of Russian history, they would have known that messing around in Ukraine was going to get Russia involved. It was going to mean a Russian invasion. It was going to happen. And so from the perspective of the Russians, the United States meddling, and it was the United States meddling in Ukraine was intolerable. That for them, it's one thing to be doing it in Lithuania or Latvia. Ukraine, not going to allow it. And again, it would be the only thing I could think of that's comparable, and even then, the analogy doesn't exactly work, would be like, let's just say that the Warsaw Pact was toppling a regime, a pro-Russian regime in Ottawa, in Canada, and installing a communist regime there. I know the jokes that are going to come here, which is that they have a communist regime there. But the point being that the United States, you think the United States would sit still while Canada was being weaponized, militarized against us? Not a chance. the tanks would roll into Canada to say, you're not taking this one. This will not happen. And that's kind of what's been going on in this particular case. The arrogance of American diplomacy in all of this really can't be overestimated. Putin's warnings were consistently ignored, and in 2014, the Obama administration engineered the so-called Maiden Revolution, which was no revolution at all. It was a coup d'etat to topple a democratically elected, but catch this, pro-Russian Ukrainian government. So the Obama administration, via the CIA, toppled a democratically elected but pro-Russian Ukrainian regime in the so-called Maidan Revolution. And if you don't know what that is, in Kyiv, there's a square there. It's the Maidan Square. Maidan simply means square. That's all it is. And it was there that people gathered, and it was there that the so-called revolution, began. But it was all engineered and with the use of social media, a variety of other things, in order to create the appearance of a popular revolution. But it wasn't a popular revolution. It was a coup d'etat that was brought about by the Obama administration. This is what they wanted. So the people who orchestrated that particular coup were, do you recognize any of the names? Susan Rice, Anthony Blinken, and Victoria Nuland, just to name just a few. And by the way, though some of them are the same names that are alleged to have met with Zelensky prior to his White House meltdown with Donald Trump, just last week. So shortly after that revolution, so-called the Maidan Revolution in 2014, the tanks rolled. Putin said, enough, I've had it. And he sent the tanks into Ukraine. So the war was on at that point. Now, everyone wants to point to the fact, to me, this looks a little bit like kind of what you see. I'm a football fan, and you often see this where a guy is getting in somebody else's face, and he's, calling him names, or, he's using, really rough language, his mother, or whatever he might be saying. And finally, the other guy's had enough, and he lashes out and he hits him. And then he's the guy who gets flagged. To me, that's kind of what has been going on in this particular case. The United States arrogantly decided, and callously decided, you know what, it would just be, let's just, for the hell of it, let's just use Ukraine to poke the Russian bear. Let's just become a thorn in Putin's side. To quote Lindsey Graham, we're willing to fight Russia to the last Ukrainian. The idea here being it's making cynical use of Ukraine. You would think a guy like Zelensky would pick up on that. Do you not understand that Democrats have used you? Do you not understand that Donald Trump is trying to save your country so there'll be something left? Do you not understand that Democrats and their globalist allies, rhinos too, who've been a part of this, guys like Crenshaw and the aforementioned Lindsey Graham and Mitch McConnell and the whole Washington war machine, to say nothing of the EU, they have all used you to grind your own population and that of Russia's population. Just because they could. They want to sell weapons. They want to launder money. They want biolabs. That's why they did it. You'd think you'd pick up on that he would see that Donald Trump is not his enemy. Donald Trump's his friend. Donald Trump is the one who's saying, look, the best advice I can give you, Zelensky, is you cannot win this war. And while we still can, let's negotiate a settlement, the best settlement that we can get for you and for your people, and bring peace so that you're not having to go into homes and drag a mother's son out and throw him into a car and drive him to the front so that he can be killed. I mean, this is the kind of stuff that they're doing. This, by the way, is what Vice President Vance brought up in the conversation with Zelensky at the White House. So anyway, when Biden came to power, when he came to the Oval Office via, very dubious means in 2020, the same cast of characters reappeared to direct his Ukrainian policy. And who were they? Well, his Secretary of State. Guess who? Anthony Blinken. And Blinken, what did he do? Well, he immediately publicly invited Ukraine to join NATO. Now that was meant to be, that's just an effort again to provoke Putin, to provoke Russia, because Putin had already said that's not going to happen. I'm not going to allow that. But now here's Blinken saying, hey, we think it'd be a good idea. You guys should come and join NATO. And Zelensky, very foolishly, just a couple of days ago, said in a tweet where he apologized to Trump, kind of sort of apologized and said he's ready to sign a deal. He's talking about security guarantees. And in a couple of interviews, he said, yeah, I'll resign in exchange for NATO membership. I just do not see Putin willing to sign any kind of peace agreement where Ukraine is a part of NATO. I think what Putin has signaled in past he is willing to tolerate is a neutral government in Ukraine, neither necessarily pro-Russian or pro-American, just a neutral government. Some people have criticized Orban, president of Hungary, who recently said some nice things, sort of about Putin as well as the West. And people are going, what is he doing? He's doing what the president or the king or the prince, the leader, the prime minister of a border state, and they're not exactly a border state, they border Ukraine, but Ukraine's at war with Russia, and Hungary could be easily invaded, by Russia. He's doing what a wise leader of a border state does, and that is to say, look, I'm neither going to tie myself really, really strongly with the West or really, really strongly with the East. I want to be everybody's friend. That's what he's doing. And honestly, I would think one of the last things you would want to do is to tie yourself too strongly to the United States, which has a history of abandoning its allies anyway. So Orban he's being shrewd. He's doing exactly what Zelensky has not been. Zelensky, I am thoroughly convinced that Zelensky's behavior in the White House was driven by possibly, Susan Rice denies it, but I think it's all nonsense. She denies that she or anybody met with Zelensky prior to his meeting in the White House. I think she's lying. I think she knows she's lying. But I think what was added to Zelensky's behavior there is I think it was drug fueled. I really believe the guy is on, I don't know if it's amphetamines. It looks like cocaine because, as I pointed out to you, over the course of a show, I might do that. But it's the way they do it. It's a constant sniffing and it's a constant kind of checking of their nose. They're always concerned that there's a little white powder that might be visible, and a constant watch him. I actually isolated him, and I did a little screen record where I just I cropped it down where it's just his head, and you're watching his behavior. The guy's on drugs. He's on drugs. So he's been anything but wise throughout any of this. But again, Blinken, what does he do? In 2021, he invites Ukraine to join NATO. And Biden, in the same year, he attempted two unsuccessful pro-democracy coups d'etats in two other Russian border states, Kazakhstan and Belarus. Now, again, very, very vital border states from a Russian perspective. Both of those so-called pro-democracy coups d'etats, both of them failed. But again, it signaled to Putin, as if he needed any further evidence, of the United States' policy of implacable hatred towards him, and that they would stop at nothing to topple him. And so what did Putin do? He doubles down in Ukraine. He expands the war in Ukraine, and that's because he rightly viewed Western meddling in Ukraine as an existential threat to himself every bit as much as JFK had once viewed Cuba. So where does that take us now? Where are we now in all of this? Well, here's the vital bit. If you've heard nothing else that I've said so far, the vital bit is that Ukraine has zero path to victory that doesn't include a massive commitment of U.S. ground forces. The Norwegians aren't going to save them. The French aren't going to save them. What is it that Norman Schwarzkopf said of the French? He said, going to war without the French is like going to war without an accordion. Sometimes I feel that way about David French too. Going to war without David French is like going to war without an accordion. Anyway, it won't be the British army that saves Ukraine. It wouldn't be the Spaniards. It's not going to be the Swedes or the Finns that save them. I mean, no disrespect towards their armed forces. Well, I do towards the French, but otherwise I don't. They just don't have it. They don't have the muscle. They don't have the manpower. They don't have the technology. They do not have the military might. The only ally that Ukraine has that could turn this war, which they're losing, into a victory is if the United States were to commit hundreds of thousands, possibly millions of troops to war. And let me tell you, it would be millions, because Russia would be fighting for their very survival. They're fighting for the homeland, which makes for a whole different, kind of war. I've seen some people say that this would be a potential, Vietnam or potential Korea, potential Afghanistan. I beg to differ. This would be World War III. This would be World War III. If the United States ends up in a hot war with Ukraine, not one where they're fighting by proxy, but in a hot war, a direct war with Russia, this becomes World War III, and it will involve the whole of Europe. It'll involve the whole of NATO, and what do you think is going to happen in the Middle East? I mean, that's a powder keg right there. Could very easily expand to include the Middle East, and then watching it all is China, and they're going to want in on the spoils. And right now, guess who they're allied with? Not us. Not us. So Ukraine suddenly becomes like what Churchill once said of the Balkans, when asked where would the next war come from? He said, probably this is pre-World War I. He said, probably some damn fool thing in the Balkans. We proved to be right. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo in 1914 was the damn fool thing that in the Balkans that led to a world war. And in this case, the damn fool thing is the damn fool thing that was started by the Obama administration in Ukraine. And it's hurtling us rapidly towards World War III. And as I said before, while Western leaders, with the exception of Trump, I guess there are a couple of others, but most of the NATO states, while they're having their Harry Met Sally, orgasmic moments, they're so excited about the possibility of world war. Donald Trump has been the sole voice of reason, and you're a fool. I mean, you're a fool not to be on his side on this. It means you have let your hatred of Donald Trump just go to your head and just rob you. I mean, this truly is Trump derangement syndrome, where you've just let it rob you of all rationality, of all sensibility. If you're young, in particular, if you're a parent, we're talking about your children fighting and possibly dying. For what? For what? I'll come back to that in a moment. When I was getting my degrees in European and Russian history, it was during NATO's eastward expansion. And at least part of it was during that period of time. And the feeling at that time was, Russia is weak. Now is the time, for NATO to expand. We need to capitalize on this moment. And even as a young grad student, I remember, questioning the wisdom of that. I thought, now isn't now the time to make Russia our friend? Isn't now the time to say, hey, we're not the threat that you always thought we were, but seems that we're actually proving them right, that we're taking a very aggressive posture towards them and proving what every Soviet leader always said, which was that we had designs on conquering them. has the potential to become a catastrophic world war. And unfortunately, as Americans, we often have a very limited, historical memory. And these days, given the kind of education a lot of people are receiving in schools, whether it be a public or private school, is often so poor, they don't know this history anyway. So let me give you just a little bit of it. On the outskirts of Russia, excuse me, not the outskirts of Russia, on the outskirts of Moscow, you'll see these rusted tanks. There's a couple of, there's Victory Park, where they have a lot of captured armor, that sits there, and where they recently displayed American Abrams tanks to say, look at this, we've captured, American hardware, military hardware in Ukraine, and the Russian people poured out to see it. But on the outskirts of Moscow, you will see these lone Panzers, German tanks, rusted out, and they mark the farthest advance of the Wehrmacht, the German army, in 1941, before the Red Army halted their advance. Now, of the roughly 55 million casualties in World War II, half of them were Russian. Half of them. I mean, think on that for a moment. The Russians lost more people in just a couple of separate battles, and not those battles collectively, but each of them separately. In the Battle of Leningrad, modern-day St. Petersburg, and Stalingrad, they lost more people individually in those battles than we lost the entire war. Times 2, times 3, many more. The point that I'm making here is that the Russians have a capacity for suffering. Their nation has known extraordinary strife, internally, oppression, long before Putin, through the Tsarist regimes and straight through the Soviet period, and now with Putin, they've known extraordinary hardship, and they didn't surrender. The American people, we have known, it's come up several times, the White House meeting, and then Trump mentioned it last night. We have this wonderful ocean, that separates us, the Atlantic, that separates us from Europe. Well, I like to say that we have these wonderful anti-tank barriers, known as the Atlantic and the Pacific. And the result is that we've never known war, not since the American Civil War. We've not known occupation. We've not known house to house, block to block, city to city fighting in our own streets. And the result of that is that the American people could enter into World War I and World War II somewhat leisurely when they were ready to enter in. We're not prepared for the kind of war that a war with Russia would be. Would it be unwinnable? No, I don't think it would be unwinnable. But a conversation I was having with my youngest son, who was he and his wife are joining us here in Rome briefly, is one that I think reflects some of the thinking of his own generation. And he has been, well educated, and that is, he was thinking in terms of, all the nifty technology that we have, the drones, and, it's all like a video game. Every war in the 20th century, they would say similar things to that. The weapons now, war will be over when? By Christmas. It'll be over by Christmas. It wasn't. Curtis LeMay thought he could win through the use of the United States Army Air Force. The United States Air Force wasn't formed as a separate military entity until 1946, but the United States Army Air Force, he could win with that alone. Strategic bombing is all it would take. Guess what? It wasn't all that it took. It required ground forces. They thought they could do the same thing in Vietnam. Kissinger, linebacker 1, linebacker 2. We will just absolutely annihilate. There's some kids down here having some fun in this piazza behind me here in Rome. So I don't think anybody's been killed right now. War has not come to Rome yet. War has been here, by the way. The city was sacked by the Goths and Visigoths, but that was a long time ago. Anyway, every war in the 20th century, and now we move into the 21st century, they thought they could win it because the technology was on the cutting edge. We have now bigger bigger artillery. We have bigger planes. We have bigger bombers. We now have drones. We now have this. We now have that. We see everything with satellites. Didn't work in Afghanistan. I mean, a bunch of sheep herders managed to drive the Russians and the United States out of their country. So the point I'm making is that a war with Russia, a hot war with Russia, would be absolutely a bloodbath. Now, I was raised in the military. I believe that there are things that are worth fighting and dying for. Those of you who follow my work know that I have risked my life on numerous occasions for the things that I believe in. And I don't say that lightly. I mean, genuinely risking my life, going into very dangerous kind of circumstances for things that I believe in. But I would want to say this. This war isn't it. This war isn't it. Millions would die. Millions of Americans would die. And for what? Ukrainian freedom and democracy? Don't be naive. Ukraine is no more democratic than Russia, and it's no less corrupt than Russia. There are no good guys in this war, least of all the bureaucrats of the Obama and Biden administrations, meaning the United States has been one of the most nefarious players in this whole thing. And I'm not interested in seeing my children or someone else's children die in a war in Ukraine, for a war that Susan Rice and Anthony Blinken and Victoria Nuland decided they wanted to start because they just wanted to piss Putin off, and they wanted a place to launder their money and to traffic people. I mean, these are the kinds of things that are going on in Ukraine. So in this particular war, there are no good guys. There are only opportunists and victims. So I hope that helps you to understand a little bit of the context of where we are. And I just want to express my admiration for the fact that Donald Trump is seeking peace when the whole world is conspiring against him. Except the people who elected him, the people who are talking to him, or rather that he was talking to in his recent address before Congress. EU, they want war. The Uniparty wants war. The Washington war machine wants war. The World Economic Forum, they want war. The globalists want war. Zelensky wants war. I don't think his people do. He only has 16% approval rating, and he probably had to lie to get that. But I think Donald Trump cares, and I think he cares that millions, roughly now, 1.5 million people, it's estimated, have died in this war, Russian boys and Ukrainian boys. And I think Trump wants to see that war ended before it expands and it gets much, much worse than it is. This has been another episode of Ideas Have Consequences. See, they're cheering. Another episode of Ideas Have Consequences with me, Larry Alex Taunton, and I'm looking forward to getting home.